Carl Jung, the psychiatrist who founded analytical psychology, spent decades studying people who felt out of sync with the world's timeline. People who seemed to be running on a schedule no one else could see. Everyone around you seemed to have already figured it out. They had picked their careers, they were building relationships, moving forward with a kind of confidence that, from the outside, looked almost effortless, natural even. And there you were, watching, feeling something you couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly envy, it wasn't exactly confusion. It was closer to a quiet, stubborn certainty that the path everyone else was walking wasn't yours. And at the same time, you couldn't find yours either. So you hesitated. You moved from one thing to the next. You started things and stopped. You watched the years go by while the people around you accumulated all the visible signs of a life well built. And underneath all of that searching, one voice you couldn't fully silence kept saying the same thing. I'm not behind. I'm just not ready yet. Jung, working from within the tradition he called depth psychology, spent decades studying people exactly like that. And one of the most useful ways to read his work is this: not every personality adapts early. Some people are built for depth before speed, for a life that doesn't unfold in a straight line, but that first turns inward before it can expand outward. Jung called this process individuation, and he saw it as central to the development of a more whole, more authentic self, what he referred to simply as the self with a capital S. The self, in Jungian terms, is the archetype of wholeness, the destination the individuation process moves toward. Unlike Freud, Jung believed the unconscious wasn't just a storage unit for repressed trauma. He saw it as an active source of growth and meaning. Today, the goal is to show you why the people who feel most out of sync with their own time, most out of step with the world's schedule, are often the very ones who, later, manage to live their own lives most fully. Signal 1. Your inner world is too alive for early adaptation. Most people build their identity quickly. They absorb the world around them. They copy values, goals, ambitions, rhythms, and up to a point, that works. It produces confidence early, but it can also produce shallow foundations. The rare personality works differently. Its inner world is unusually alive. Thoughts, emotions, symbols, and intuitions arrive all at once, with an intensity that's hard to explain. In Jungian psychology, this can be understood as a psyche in which unconscious material is especially active. Jung made an important distinction here between the personal unconscious, the layer that holds an individual's repressed memories and forgotten experiences, and the collective unconscious, the deeper layer shared across humanity where the archetypes live. For this kind of personality, both layers speak loudly. One where the archetypes of the collective unconscious speak louder than social expectations. And here's the problem that creates early in life. When the inner world is louder than the outer one, adaptation becomes complicated. You can't simply become what society expects you to be. Not because you're rebellious, not because you're difficult, but because something in you refuses a false alignment. Something senses, before you even have the words for it, that becoming what everyone expects would require giving up something you can't afford to lose. Jung also observed that certain personalities are naturally drawn toward introversion, a term he himself coined and later formalized in his landmark work Psychological Types, and that introverted people generate their energy from the internal world, not the external one. That makes them especially resistant to identities imposed from the outside. So you stall. You put off choices that other people seem to make without a second thought. Career paths, relationships, identities. From the outside, that looks like confusion. From the inside, it feels like suffocation. From a Jungian perspective, forcing an identity too early can create a split between the social role a person performs and the self that's still forming underneath. A life lived in the wrong shape eventually starts to crack at the edges. The hesitation wasn't weakness. It may have been the psyche protecting the self that was still becoming. Signal 2. The delay isn't stagnation, it's incubation. In your 20s, the contrast probably started to hurt. Other people were moving forward. Promotions, marriages, social confidence, visible momentum. And you felt stuck. Maybe you moved from one path to another without landing anywhere. Maybe you pulled back into yourself. Maybe from the outside you looked like someone who just couldn't get started. But a Jungian reading would suggest something different about that period. Maybe the psyche was doing something invisible. While other people were building social structures, you were building a psychological one. You were asking questions most people don't get to until much later. Who am I, really? Which of the things I believe are actually mine, and which were handed to me pre-formed? What am I finally willing to stop pretending? Those questions slow you down, but they can also protect you later. Jung wrote extensively about the second half of life, about how a person may at some point need to turn inward, especially when the external life no longer feels like enough. What most people today call a midlife crisis, Jung saw not as collapse, but an invitation into the individuation process. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he described his own midlife period, his break with Freud, his descent into his own unconscious, as the most formative and disorienting years of his life, the years that made everything else possible. Some people build fast, and only later discover that the life they built had the right shape, but not the right fit. The rare personality pays a different kind of price. It pays early, in confusion, in searching, in that specific loneliness of not belonging where everyone else seems to belong. But maybe it doesn't pay that price later, because it never built its entire life on borrowed foundations.
Signal 3. You notice things other people prefer not to see. This is one of the most isolating aspects of this kind of personality, and one of the least talked about. From an early age, you may have picked up on things you weren't supposed to. The gap between what people said and what they actually meant. The social games running just below the surface of ordinary conversations. The emptiness inside things everyone else seemed to chase with genuine conviction. A Jungian way of understanding this is as the weight of a sharper awareness. More consciousness can bring more discomfort, because when you can see the illusions other people depend on to keep moving, participation becomes complicated. How do you compete in a game you don't believe in? How do you chase a social position you don't respect? How do you perform enthusiasm for a life that feels hollow from the inside? So you stepped back, not always visibly, but psychologically. That withdrawal could have been mistaken for passivity, for a lack of ambition, for something being wrong with you. But from a Jungian perspective, the psyche resists ways of living that violate internal integrity. There was nothing wrong with you. The psyche was simply refusing to cooperate with something that wasn't true. Here's where it's worth pausing, because something needs to be said before moving on. If you've spent years feeling behind, out of sync, like you missed a window that everyone else seemed to find without trying, consider this. Maybe the timeline you were given wasn't built for you. Maybe it was built for a different kind of person, someone who builds identity by absorbing the world instead of questioning it. Someone for whom speed is an asset, not a threat to something more important. You're not behind. Maybe you're just on a different schedule. And that schedule, the one that looks like failure from the outside, may be exactly what leads somewhere the fast track almost never reaches. Signal 4. The loneliness isn't a side effect. It may be a stage of development. For this kind of personality, loneliness isn't always accidental. Sometimes it feels almost structural. The internal complexity of these people makes shallow connection feel worse than no connection at all. They can feel like strangers even among people who genuinely care about them, invisible in groups, unreachable even in intimacy, because what they carry inside doesn't always translate easily into the language most social interactions run on. That loneliness can become especially intense in early adulthood, when the pressure to belong becomes harder to ignore. A lot of rare personalities give in at that point. They go numb, they conform, they trade the self that was forming for the relief of finally fitting somewhere. And in Jungian terms, that has a cost.
When a person betrays the self that was emerging, the rejected parts don't disappear. They often return as shadow. The archetype Jung described as the dark, rejected side of the personality, made up of everything a person refuses to acknowledge in themselves. Resentment, bitterness, a quiet anger at the version of themselves they had to become in order to be accepted. Jung's collaborator Marie-Louise von Franz wrote that this shadow material doesn't weaken over time if it's ignored. It accumulates, it waits. The longer the confrontation is avoided, the more pressure it builds behind the surface. The people who move through that loneliness without surrendering to it go through something that can't be taught and can't be rushed. They stop defining themselves by external validation. They stop chasing timelines that were never theirs. And they begin, maybe for the first time, to actually listen to something inside. That's where the real formation starts. Signal 5, the turning point, how it actually happens. At some point later in adulthood, something may begin to shift. Not suddenly, not in a way others necessarily notice at first, but internally. Something settles. Clarity begins to replace an anxiety so constant you'd stopped recognizing it as anxiety. Self-trust replaces the endless comparison. Depth replaces the urgency to appear to be somewhere you haven't arrived yet. You stop asking who you're supposed to be, and you start inhabiting who you actually are. One of the tools Jung described for this stage was active imagination, a practice of deliberately engaging with the figures and images that arise from the unconscious, not to analyze them from a distance, but to enter into dialogue with them, to let the inner world speak in its own language, and to listen without immediately translating it into something more comfortable. It sounds unusual, but for the kind of personality this video is about, it often feels like the most natural thing they've ever done. And because that self wasn't borrowed, because it was built through years of internal work no one watched, it has a quality that borrowed identities don't. Weight, stability, a groundedness other people feel before they can explain it. A Jungian way of describing this is to say the person begins to live less from adaptation and more from internal coherence. Jung sometimes called this the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold tension between opposites and produce something new. Not a compromise between the inner world and the outer one, a third thing. A self that integrates both without being consumed by either. They're no longer just trying to figure out where they fit. They become less dependent on fitting in anywhere specific. And that shift changes everything. The words carry weight, not because they speak constantly, but because when they do, nothing feels wasted. The presence communicates something steady without effort. Decisions become more precise because they come from alignment, not anxiety. This isn't confidence in the conventional sense. It's something quieter and more durable than confidence. It's coherence, an inner world too alive for early adaptation, a long incubation that looked like stagnation, the weight of seeing things other people prefer not to see, a loneliness that may have been part of the development, and a turning point that arrives later, quietly, without the fanfare early success tends to announce itself with. This kind of personality represents something the world needs but often doesn't recognize in time. A human being who refuses to trade depth for speed, who refuses to exchange truth for approval, who refuses to build a life on foundations they didn't choose and can't hold up from the inside. The success that comes from this path doesn't arrive making noise. It doesn't rot from the inside the way early success sometimes does. It expresses the person instead of consuming them. And maybe, more important than anything else, the feeling that your life actually belongs to you. That everything that happened, including the years that seemed to be going nowhere, was preparation, not waste. If you've always felt behind, maybe you're not. Maybe you're getting ready for a different kind of life, one that can't be rushed, one that only becomes possible after you stop trying to be anyone other than exactly who you are.
Now, tell me in the comments, which part of this felt like something you'd already been living but hadn't quite found the words for yet? Drop it. You'll probably be surprised how many people reading your comment are walking the same long road. If you've ever felt like you were running on a timeline that was never actually yours, and something in this video made that feel a little less heavy, subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming. I'll see you in the next one.